You thought you understood how this story would end. You believed that if you loved deeply enough, if you stayed patient enough, if you proved your loyalty in ways most people never could, then eventually they would choose you. You believed that all the confusion, all the distance, all the mixed signals were just part of a process, that one day something would click inside them and they would finally see your value the way you saw theirs. But here's the truth that changes everything. The person an avoidant ends up with is almost never who you expect, and more importantly, it's rarely the person who loved them the most. That realization stings, not because you didn't try hard enough, but because deep down you gave something real. You gave presence, you gave depth, you gave a kind of emotional connection that most people spend their entire lives searching for. And yet somehow that wasn't enough to make them stay. That's where the confusion begins, because it makes you question everything: your worth, your approach, even your understanding of love itself. But what if the outcome had nothing to do with your value at all? What if the entire dynamic was being driven by something happening inside them that you were never meant to fix? To understand who they end up with, you first have to understand what's really going on beneath their behavior. Because on the surface it looks like inconsistency. It looks like they care one moment and pull away the next. It feels like they're sending signals that contradict each other. But underneath all of that is a deeper conflict, one that most people never fully see. There's a part of them that genuinely craves connection. They want closeness, they want love, they want to feel understood. But at the exact same time, there's another part of them that associates closeness with danger. Not physical danger, but emotional exposure. Vulnerability feels like losing control, and for them, control equals safety. So when they meet someone who offers real depth, real intimacy, something powerful happens. At first, they're drawn in, they feel something rare, something they don't usually experience. And that's what makes the beginning feel so intense, so magnetic, so unforgettable. You weren't imagining that connection, it was real. But as that connection deepens, it begins to activate the very fear they've spent their life trying to avoid. The closer you get, the more seen they feel, and the more seen they feel, the more exposed they become. And that exposure starts to feel overwhelming. This is the part most people misunderstand. You think they pulled away because something was missing, but in reality, they often pull away because something was too real, too deep, too emotionally activating. It wasn't the absence of connection that scared them, it was the presence of it. And instead of processing that fear, instead of leaning into the discomfort and growing through it, they instinctively create distance, not because they don't feel, but because they feel more than they know how to handle. That's why the type of person everyone assumes they'll end up with doesn't always match reality. You might think they'll eventually choose someone emotionally strong, someone patient, someone who understands them on a deep level. And yes, that kind of person seems like the perfect match on paper. Someone who can hold space, someone who doesn't pressure them, someone who offers stability. But here's where the truth shifts: those qualities only work if the person is ready to receive them. And if they're not, even the healthiest kind of love can feel like pressure. Because from their perspective, depth isn't always comfort, sometimes it feels like responsibility. Being loved deeply means they have to show up emotionally. It means they can't hide behind distance forever. It means they have to confront parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. And if they're not ready for that, they won't move toward it, they'll move away from it, even if it means leaving behind someone who truly cared. So instead of choosing based on who loves them the most, they often choose based on what feels emotionally manageable, not what's most fulfilling, but what feels safest. And safety for them doesn't mean closeness. It means a relationship where they don't feel overwhelmed, where they don't feel like they're constantly being pulled into emotional depth, where they can maintain a sense of control over how much they give and when they give it. That's the real pattern nobody talks about. They're not choosing the best connection, they're choosing the least triggering one. They're not choosing the person who sees them the most clearly, they're choosing the person who doesn't require them to be fully seen. And that distinction changes everything, because it explains why the outcome often feels so unfair. You gave them something real, something meaningful, something that had depth and potential, and yet they gravitated towards something that seems, on the surface, less significant. And that's where the pain cuts the deepest. Because it makes you feel replaceable. It makes you feel like all the effort, all the understanding, all the patience didn't matter, but it did matter, just not in the way you expected. You weren't rejected because you lacked something. You were avoided because you activated something. There's a difference, and once you see that difference, you start to understand why they often leave the person who loved them the most. It's not because that love wasn't enough. It's because that love required a version of them they weren't ready to become. Being with you meant growth. It meant emotional honesty. It meant facing fears they've been running from for years. And for someone who's built their entire sense of safety around avoiding those feelings that can feel like too much, so they step back. They create distance. Sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, and from your perspective, it feels confusing, even painful, because nothing outwardly went wrong. There wasn't always a clear conflict, a clear reason, a clear ending, just a slow shift or a sudden withdrawal. And you're left trying to make sense of something that doesn't follow logical rules. But from their perspective, the logic is emotional, not rational. Distance equals relief, space equals control, and control equals safety. So even if part of them misses you, even if part of them knows what they lost, the stronger instinct is to return to what feels manageable. And this is where another shift happens, the moment you stop chasing. Because as long as you were the one holding the connection together, as long as you were the one reaching out, understanding, giving, adjusting, they never had to fully feel your absence. Your presence was constant, even if theirs wasn't. But the moment you pull your energy back, the moment you stop trying to fix what was never yours to fix, something changes. At first it feels like silence, like nothing is happening, like they've completely moved on without a second thought. And that's the part that tests you the most, because it challenges your belief in the connection you felt. It makes you question if it was ever real to them at all. But what you don't see is what happens internally. When the dynamic shifts, when you're no longer there to stabilize the emotional distance, they're left alone with their own patterns, and for the first time they start to feel the absence not as pressure, but as space. Space where your presence used to be, space where your energy used to exist. And that's when the realization begins to surface, even if it's slow, even if it's quiet, because now the connection isn't overwhelming anymore, it's gone, and that changes how it's processed. But even then, it doesn't always lead to immediate action, because awareness doesn't automatically equal change. They might feel it, they might think about you, they might even miss you in ways they never expressed before. But unless they're willing to confront the deeper pattern inside them, they'll still be pulled toward what feels easier, what feels safer, what feels less emotionally demanding. And that's why who they end up with can seem so confusing from the outside, because it's not a reflection of who was better, it's a reflection of what they were ready for. And that's the truth most people never tell you, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because suddenly, the story stops being about who was better and starts revealing something much deeper about emotional capacity. And this is where things take another turn, because now you begin to understand what actually happens after you. When you finally step back, when you stop chasing, when you stop trying to be the one who holds everything together, the dynamic doesn't just end, it transforms. Not always outwardly, not always in a way you can see, but internally something begins to shift. Because for the first time, you're no longer filling the emotional space that used to exist between you. And this is where many people get it wrong. They think that once they pull away, the other person instantly realizes everything and comes running back. But that's not how it works. Not for someone who has built their identity around emotional distance. At first, what they feel isn't loss, it's relief. Relief from the intensity, relief from the expectation, relief from the unspoken pressure to go deeper than they're comfortable with. And that part hurts to hear, because it feels like everything you gave only pushed them further away. But that relief is temporary. It's not peace, it's just the absence of emotional activation. And over time, something else starts to take its place. Because now, without your presence, without your energy, without your consistency, they're left with themselves. And that's when the silence starts to speak. Not loudly, not all at once, but in small, quiet moments. Moments where they notice the difference. Moments where they realize that what they had with you wasn't something they experience often. But instead of immediately returning, instead of suddenly transforming, they usually take a different path first, a path that looks easier on the surface. They move towards someone new. And this is where the illusion deepens, because from the outside, it looks like they've moved on effortlessly. It looks like they've found someone who fits them better, someone who doesn't create the same friction, someone who doesn't trigger the same push and pull dynamic. And if you're watching this from a distance, it can feel like a final confirmation of your worst fear that they simply didn't choose you. But what you're seeing isn't the full picture, because the person they move toward next often represents something very specific, not deeper love but lower emotional demand, not stronger connection but easier interaction. These relationships are built on a different foundation, one where expectations are lighter, where emotional intensity is reduced, where the need to show up fully isn't as present. And for someone who struggles with emotional closeness, that can feel like the perfect situation. At first, because now they're in a dynamic where they don't feel overwhelmed, they don't feel like they're constantly being pulled into deeper conversations, deeper feelings, deeper vulnerability. Everything feels more relaxed, more controlled, more predictable. And for them, that feels like success. It feels like they've finally found something that works. But what's actually happening is something much more subtle. They're choosing comfort over depth. They're choosing emotional safety over emotional connection. And while that may feel good in the beginning, it comes with a cost that doesn't show up immediately, because the absence of depth doesn't just remove pressure, it also removes meaning. It removes the kind of connection that creates lasting emotional impact. It removes the intensity that once made something feel real, and over time that absence starts to become noticeable. But here's where it gets even more complex, because the comparison doesn't happen consciously at first. It's not like they sit there and say, "This isn't as deep as before." It's more like a quiet feeling, a subtle awareness that something is missing, even if they can't fully explain what it is. And that's when your memory starts to resurface, not necessarily as regret right away, but as contrast, because now they've experienced both sides. They've experienced what it feels like to be deeply connected and what it feels like to be comfortably distant. And while the second option feels safer, it also feels less alive. But even then, they may stay, because intensity, as much as it creates connection, also creates fear for them. And that fear doesn't just disappear because they recognize what's missing. In fact, sometimes that awareness makes them double down on what feels safe, because going back toward depth would mean facing the same emotional challenges they avoided in the first place. So they stay in what's easier. And this is the part that confuses so many people, because you look at the situation and think, how can they choose something that seems so surface level? But again, it's not about choosing the best, it's about choosing what they can handle. Because for them, intense love doesn't always feel like a gift. Sometimes it feels like a threat, not because it's harmful, but because it requires them to open in ways they're not used to. It requires them to be seen without filters, without distance, without control. And that level of exposure can feel overwhelming, even if it's coming from a place of genuine care. So when faced with the choice between something deep and something easy, they often choose easy. Not because they don't recognize the difference, but because they don't yet have the capacity to sustain the depth. And this brings you to another layer of understanding the role of control in everything they do, because at the core of their behavior is one primary need to feel in control of their emotional experience. Control over how much they give, when they give it, and how close someone is allowed to get. And any situation that threatens that control, even in a healthy way, can trigger their instinct to pull back. That's why they often gravitate toward dynamics where they feel less emotionally exposed, where the other person isn't constantly reaching for more, where they can exist without feeling like they're being asked to grow beyond their current limits. It's not always intentional. It's not always something they consciously choose, but it's something they consistently repeat. And the more you understand that, the more you start to see the pattern clearly. You start to realize that their choices were never random. They were always aligned with one thing: emotional manageability. Not emotional fulfillment, not emotional depth, but emotional manageability. And once you truly see that, something inside you begins to shift, because now the story isn't about why you weren't chosen. It's about why what you offered required more than they were ready to give. And that realization doesn't erase the pain, but it transforms it. Because now, instead of questioning your worth, you start questioning the dynamic itself. You start seeing that what felt like rejection was actually a reflection of their limitations, not your value. And that's where your power begins to return. Not in trying to change their outcome, but in finally understanding it. And that's where your power begins to return, not in trying to rewrite the past, but in finally seeing it for what it was. Because once you understand that their choices were rooted in what they could emotionally handle, not what was most meaningful, another question naturally rises to the surface. What happens when they meet someone just like them? Because it does happen. Sometimes they don't move towards someone softer, more open, or more emotionally available. Sometimes they end up with someone who mirrors their own patterns, someone who also values space, who also avoids deep emotional exposure, who also keeps a certain distance even within closeness. And from the outside, that kind of connection can look surprisingly stable. There's less conflict, less pressure, less emotional intensity. No one is asking for too much. No one is pushing for deeper conversations. No one is challenging the other to open beyond their comfort zone. Everything feels balanced. But that balance comes at a price. Because when both people are avoiding depth, the relationship becomes more about coexistence than connection. It functions, but it doesn't fully expand. It survives, but it doesn't truly evolve. There's a quiet understanding between them, but not always a deep emotional bond. And for someone who fears emotional overwhelm, that can feel like the perfect arrangement. No triggers, no pressure, no expectations they can't meet, but also no real growth, no real transformation, no real depth. It's a connection that stays within limits, because both people are unconsciously maintaining those limits together. And while that may feel safe, it often lacks the kind of emotional richness that creates something lasting and fulfilling on a deeper level. And this is where something important becomes clear. Not all relationships that last are deeply connected. Some simply persist because they don't challenge the people within them to grow. But then there's another path, a rarer one, the moment when everything they've been avoiding finally catches up to them. Because patterns don't disappear, they repeat. And over time, even the safest dynamics begin to reveal their limitations. Even the easiest connections begin to feel incomplete. And eventually there comes a point where the comfort they once chose starts to feel like emptiness. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet dissatisfaction. And that's when something begins to shift. Not because someone else changed them, but because their own experience starts to show them what they've been missing. This is the stage where growth becomes possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. Because now the awareness is there. They begin to recognize the pattern. They begin to see how they've been choosing safety over depth. They begin to understand that avoiding discomfort has also meant avoiding connection. And this is the only place where something different can happen. Because for the first time, the choice isn't being made from fear, it's being made from awareness. And if they reach that point, if they truly confront themselves, they may finally become capable of something they couldn't sustain before a relationship with someone emotionally secure. But this doesn't happen easily, it doesn't happen quickly, and it doesn't happen just because they meet the right person. It only happens when they become the version of themselves that can receive that kind of love without running from it. Because a secure connection isn't just about finding someone stable, it's about being able to exist within that stability without feeling the need to escape it. And that requires growth, real growth. The kind that forces them to sit with discomfort instead of avoiding it. The kind that requires emotional honesty instead of emotional distance. The kind that challenges everything they've built their sense of safety around. And until that happens, even the most secure person won't feel like the right fit. Not because they aren't enough, but because they represent something the avoidant hasn't yet learned how to hold. And this is where one of the most important truths finally comes into focus. It was never about you not being enough. It was about them not being ready. Because when someone isn't ready for depth, they won't choose it even if it's exactly what they need. They'll move toward what feels easier, what feels lighter, what feels safer in the moment. And that can create one of the most painful illusions of all, the idea that you were too much, too emotional, too deep, too intense. But the truth is, you weren't too much. You were just more than they knew how to meet. You were offering a level of connection that required them to step out of their comfort zone, and they weren't ready to do that. Not at that time, not in that version of themselves. And instead of rising to meet you, they retreated to protect what felt familiar. So what you experienced wasn't a reflection of your value, it was a reflection of their limits. And once you truly understand that, something inside you begins to soften. Because now, you're no longer measuring yourself against their choices. You're no longer trying to make sense of why someone who felt so deeply connected to you could walk away, because now you see it clearly. They didn't walk away from you because you lacked something. They walked away because you awakened something, and that awakening required more than they were ready to face. Which is why, in many ways, you were never just another connection in their life. You were the one that showed them something different, something deeper, something real. And that's exactly why it felt so intense, and exactly why it couldn't last in the way you hoped, at least not without change. But here's what most people don't realize until much later. Even if they move on, even if they choose something easier, even if they build a life that looks stable from the outside, they don't forget that depth. Because once someone experiences a connection that goes beyond the surface, it leaves an imprint. And that imprint doesn't disappear just because they chose something else. It stays, quietly, in the background. And over time it starts to resurface in ways they didn't expect, in moments of stillness, in moments of comparison, in moments where something feels missing, but they can't quite explain why. And that's when the questions begin, not always out loud, but internally. What if that was different? What if I handled that differently? What if I let something real go because I wasn't ready? And this is where the idea of regret starts to form. Not immediate, not obvious, but gradual. Because regret, for someone who avoids emotions, doesn't always show up as pain right away. It shows up as realization, delayed, subtle, but persistent. And this is something you rarely get to see, because by the time they begin to feel it, you're often no longer there. You've already started your own journey. You've already begun to heal, to grow, to detach from the version of the story that once held you in place. And yet, somewhere in their experience, that connection still exists. Not as something they fully understand, but as something they can't completely replace. And that's when another truth becomes undeniable. You weren't just someone who loved them, you were someone who changed their awareness. And even if they couldn't meet you at that level, then that doesn't mean it meant nothing. It means it meant more than they knew how to handle. And that's why it stayed with them in ways they couldn't fully express at the time. Because even when they move forward, even when life seems to carry them in a different direction, there comes a phase that almost no one talks about, the silent phase, where everything they once avoided begins to echo back to them. This is the stage where the noise of distraction fades, where the surface-level connections no longer feel new, where the comfort they once chose starts to feel incomplete, and in that quiet space, something begins to surface that they can no longer outrun. Not you as a person at first, but the feeling, the depth, the way they felt when they were with you. Because now, without the pressure, without the immediacy of the connection, without the fear of being pulled too deep too fast, they can finally process it differently, and what once felt overwhelming begins to feel meaningful. This is the silent regret phase. Not the kind of regret that shows up dramatically, not the kind that leads to instant action, but the kind that lingers beneath the surface, the kind that appears in moments when they least expect it, a memory that hits out of nowhere, a thought that stays longer than it should, a realization that something rare passed through their life and they didn't fully hold on to it. But even here there's complexity, because feeling regret doesn't automatically mean they'll come back. It doesn't automatically mean they'll reach out, or change, or suddenly become the version of themselves you needed them to be, because awareness and action are not the same thing. And this is one of the hardest truths to accept. Someone can realize your value and still not be ready to meet it. Someone can miss you and still not know how to show up for you. Someone can understand what they lost and still not have the emotional capacity to rebuild it. And that's where the difference between feeling and becoming becomes clear. Because what they feel in that moment is real. The regret, the awareness, the recognition, it's not fake. But unless it leads to inner change, it remains just that, a feeling. And feelings alone don't create lasting transformation. This is why so many people get caught in the cycle of waiting. Waiting for the message, waiting for the apology, waiting for the moment when everything finally makes sense and comes back together. But the truth is, closure doesn't always come in the form of their return. Sometimes closure comes in the form of your understanding, your clarity, your ability to see the full picture without needing them to complete it for you. Because once you understand the difference between who they wanted and who they were capable of choosing, everything shifts. They may have wanted depth. They may have felt something real with you. They may have recognized, even if only subconsciously, that what you offered was rare. But what they chose was based on something else entirely. Not desire but capacity. Not connection but comfort. Not potential but what felt manageable in their current state. And that's the distinction that changes everything, because it removes you from the equation of comparison. It shows you that this was never a competition between you and someone else. It was a reflection of where they were emotionally. And once you truly accept that, something inside you begins to release. The need to understand every detail, the need to replay every moment, the need to question whether you could have done something differently. Because now you see it clearly, you could have been perfect in every way, and the outcome would have remained the same if they weren't ready. And that realization doesn't just bring clarity, it brings freedom. Freedom from the illusion that love alone is enough to make someone stay. Freedom from the belief that you have to prove your worth to be chosen. Freedom from the emotional weight of trying to fix something that was never yours to fix. And in that freedom, something powerful begins to happen. You start to turn inward. You start to reconnect with the parts of yourself that were lost in the process of trying to hold everything together. The parts of you that gave, that understood, that stayed even when it was difficult. And instead of seeing those qualities as weaknesses, you begin to see them as strengths. Because the truth is, your ability to love deeply was never the problem. It was never something you needed to reduce or hide or control. It was something that simply met someone who couldn't hold it. And that doesn't make it wrong, it makes it rare. And when you finally see it that way, your entire perspective shifts. Because now, instead of asking, why didn't they choose me, you begin to ask a different question: am I choosing people who are capable of choosing me back? And that question changes everything, because it puts the focus back where it belongs, on your standards, your boundaries, your emotional alignment. It reminds you that connection isn't just about how deeply you feel, it's about whether the other person can meet you in that depth. And if they can't, no amount of effort, patience, or understanding will create that capacity for them. It has to come from within, which brings you to the final truth, the one that ties everything together. Who they end up with is not a reflection of who was best for them. It's a reflection of who they were able to love at their current level of awareness. Nothing more, nothing less. If they lacked emotional depth, they chose someone who didn't require it. If they avoided vulnerability, they chose someone who didn't demand it. If they feared intimacy, they chose something that kept intimacy at a distance. And if they ever grow, truly grow, then, and only then, will their choices begin to change. Not because someone else showed up differently, but because they did. And that's why the ending you imagined didn't happen the way you expected. Not because it wasn't possible, but because it required a version of them that didn't exist yet. But here's the part that matters most. Just because they weren't capable of meeting you at your level doesn't mean someone else won't be. Because there are people who don't run from depth. People who don't see emotional connection as pressure. People who don't need distance to feel safe. People who meet presence with presence, clarity with clarity, and love with consistency. And when you align with that, when you stop chasing what avoids you and start choosing what chooses you, everything changes. Because now you're no longer trying to fit into someone else's limitations. You're stepping into a space where your depth is not just accepted, it's reciprocated. And that's the kind of connection that doesn't leave you questioning your worth. It reminds you of it. So in the end, the truth becomes clear. They didn't end up with someone better. They ended up with someone they could handle. And you were never meant to be handled. You were meant to be met.